My father-in-law claimed our baby wasn't his grandson. Then the nurse came in with paternity results. Let me start from the beginning. I'm 31, a marketing specialist at a mid-sized company, and my husband and I had been married for 3 years when we decided to start a family. We were beyond excited when the pregnancy test came back positive. My husband was over the moon, already talking about teaching our future kid how to ride a bike and taking them camping. My in-laws had always been challenging. My mother-in-law was quiet and rarely expressed her opinions, especially if they contradicted her husband's. My father-in-law, on the other hand, was a domineering presence in any room. He had very traditional views about family, and I'd always felt he didn't think I was good enough for his son. I was too independent, too career-focused, not submissive enough, whatever his reasons were. Still, we maintained a cordial relationship for my husband's sake. We'd visit for holidays, make the obligatory phone calls, and generally keep the peace. Things started changing once I got pregnant though. At first, my father-in-law seemed genuinely happy about becoming a grandfather. He'd ask how I was feeling and even bought a tiny baseball glove when we announced we were having a boy. But around my 5th month of pregnancy, something shifted. It started with little comments here and there. The baby has such a button nose in the ultrasound picture. Doesn't look like our family nose at all, he'd say, looking pointedly at my husband. Or, interesting that the due date is exactly 9 months after that work conference you attended alone. My husband would brush these comments off, saying his father had a strange sense of humor. But I could see the doubt being planted, and it hurt. I'd never given my husband any reason not to trust me, and I couldn't understand why his father was trying to create problems where none existed. By my 8th month, the comments had escalated. We were at their house for dinner when my father-in-law raised his glass for a toast. To my son, he said. May he be blessed with children of his own blood someday. The room went silent. My husband's fork clattered against his plate. Dad, what the hell is that supposed to mean? Just a toast, son, he replied with a smirk. No need to get defensive unless you have reason to be. I felt my face burning with humiliation and anger. My husband stood up, took my hand, and we left without another word. In the car, he apologized profusely, saying his father had gone too far and he would talk to him. He's just being a jerk, my husband assured me. He's always had to be the center of attention. Don't let him get to you. But it was getting to me. A lot. The stress wasn't good for the baby, and my doctor had noticed my blood pressure creeping up. She advised me to avoid stressful situations for the remainder of my pregnancy. 2 weeks before my due date, we decided to limit contact with my father-in-law. My husband called his parents and explained that we needed some space before the baby arrived. His mother seemed to understand, but his father was furious. She's turning you against your own family, I overheard him shouting through the phone. Mark my words. That baby isn't yours. My husband hung up and held me as I cried. I'm so sorry, he whispered. He won't be at the hospital when the baby's born. I promise. But promises are hard to keep when it comes to family. I went into labor a week early. Everything happened so fast. My water broke at home, contractions came quick and strong, and before I knew it, we were rushing to the hospital. My husband was my rock through it all, holding my hand, encouraging me, telling me how much he loved me. After 12 hours of labor, our beautiful son entered the world, weighing 7 pounds, 9 ounces, with a head full of dark hair just like his father's. As I held our baby for the first time, my husband beside me with tears in his eyes, everything felt perfect. That perfection lasted exactly 6 hours. I was half asleep, exhausted from labor but blissfully happy with my newborn son in the bassinet beside me. My husband had stepped out to grab some coffee. My mom had visited briefly but left to let me rest, promising to return the next morning. I heard the door to my room open and assumed it was my husband returning. Instead, I opened my eyes to see my father-in-law standing there, his face set in hard lines. My mother-in-law hovered behind him, looking uncomfortable. How are you feeling? He asked, not sounding like he particularly cared about the answer. Tired, but good, I replied cautiously. The baby's sleeping. He walked over to the bassinet and looked down at my son. I felt a surge of protectiveness. Doesn't look like my grandson, he said flatly. Excuse me? I couldn't believe he was starting this again. Here, now. You heard me. His voice grew louder. This child doesn't look anything like my son or anyone in our family. I demand a paternity test. Keep your voice down, I hissed, glancing anxiously at my sleeping baby. You need to leave. Now. I'm not going anywhere until I get answers, he retorted. My son deserves to know the truth. At that moment, my husband walked in, coffee in hand. His face darkened when he saw his father. Dad? What are you doing here? I told you we'd call when we were ready for visitors. Look at this baby, my father-in-law said, gesturing toward the bassinet. Really, look at him. He's not your son. My husband's face flushed with anger. Are you serious right now? You're doing this here? In the hospital? After my wife just gave birth to your grandson? He's not my grandson. The shouting woke the baby, who began to cry. I reached for him, my hands shaking with rage and hurt. Get out, my husband said, his voice dangerously low. Get out right now. Not until you face facts, his father insisted. This woman has been unfaithful, and you're too blind to see it. I want a paternity test. My mother-in-law finally spoke up. Please, let's not do this here. But the damage was done. Nurses had heard the commotion and entered the room, asking what was going on. One of them took the baby from me, trying to calm him while another asked if they needed to call security. Through my tears and exhaustion, I made a decision. No, I said. No security. But I want a paternity test. Right now. Everyone looked at me in surprise. Are you sure? My husband asked quietly, taking my hand. Yes. I'm sick of this. Let's end it once and for all. I turned to the nurse. Is that possible? Can we get a paternity test done immediately? The nurse nodded. We can do a DNA test here at the hospital. It requires consent from both parents, and there will be some paperwork. Do it, I said firmly. I want this settled today. My father-in-law looked smugly triumphant, as if he'd won something. My husband squeezed my hand, silently communicating his support. The next few hours were a blur. Forms were signed, cheek swabs were taken from my husband and the baby, and we were told the results would be expedited but would still take a few hours. My father-in-law insisted on staying at the hospital to hear the results in person. He sat in the waiting area, occasionally sending texts, probably updating other family members about the drama he'd created. My husband refused to leave my side, even when his father tried to pull him aside for a man-to-man talk. We sat together in strained silence, both physically and emotionally drained. I'm sorry, my husband kept saying. I never thought he'd go this far. It's not your fault, I assured him, though part of me was angry that he hadn't predicted this and prevented it. But mostly, I was just hurt and humiliated. This should have been the happiest day of our lives. Around 8 p.m., a nurse came to my room and said the results were ready. My father-in-law was called in, along with my mother-in-law who had been uncomfortably shuttling between the waiting room and my hospital room all day. A different nurse, one I hadn't seen before, entered holding an envelope. She looked at all of us with professional detachment. I have the results of the paternity test, she announced. Would you like me to read them, or would you prefer to review them privately? Read them, my father-in-law demanded before anyone else could speak. Let's hear it. The nurse looked to my husband and me for confirmation. We both nodded. She opened the envelope and began reading in a clear, clinical voice. The probability of paternity is 99.9998%. This means that the tested man is virtually proven to be the biological father of the tested child. The room went silent. My father-in-law's face drained of color. My husband let out a long, slow breath and squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. Would you like to see the results? The nurse asked, holding out the paper. My husband took it and handed it directly to his father. Here, read it yourself. My father-in-law stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For once in his life, he seemed at a loss for words. I think you owe my wife an apology, my husband said, his voice trembling with barely controlled anger. My father-in-law looked up, his expression a mix of shock and embarrassment. I was just concerned for you, son. You can't blame a father for looking out for his boy. That's not an apology, my husband snapped. You accused my wife of cheating on me in her hospital room, hours after she gave birth to our son. You need to apologize. Now I'm sorry, he muttered, not looking at me. I was mistaken. Get out, my husband said. Both of you, please leave. We'll contact you when we're ready to see you again. My mother-in-law, tears in her eyes, tugged at her husband's arm. Come on, let's go. As they left, my father-in-law turned back one last time. I was just trying to protect you, he said to my husband. You weren't protecting anyone, my husband replied. You were trying to destroy my family. My real family, my wife and son. After they left, I broke down. All the stress, pain, and anger of the day poured out of me in racking sobs. My husband held me, his own tears falling onto my hair. "It's over now," he whispered. "He can't hurt us anymore." But as I calmed down and my newborn son was placed back in my arms, I realized it wasn't over. My father-in-law had taken something precious from us, the joy and peace of our son's birthday. And despite the test results vindicating me completely, I knew that this wasn't the end of the story. Because while the truth had come out, my father-in-law hadn't truly faced any consequences for his cruel accusations. The paternity test had proven him wrong, but it hadn't made him understand how deeply he had hurt us. As I looked down at my perfect baby boy, I made a silent promise to him. I would make sure that justice was served, not out of vengeance, but because no one should be allowed to harm my family without facing real consequences. I just didn't know yet what form that justice would take, but I knew it would come. The first few weeks after bringing our baby home were a blur of sleepless nights, diaper changes, and figuring out our new normal as parents. Through it all, my husband was amazing. Changing diapers at 3 a.m., bringing me water during late-night feedings, and just generally being the partner I needed. We hadn't spoken to his parents since the hospital incident. His mother had sent texts checking in, which my husband responded to politely but briefly. His father hadn't reached out at all, which was fine by me. About 3 weeks after our son was born, I was nursing him in the nursery when my husband came in looking troubled. "My mom called," he said, sitting on the arm of the rocking chair. "She says Dad wants to see the baby." I felt a surge of anger. "Absolutely not. I told her no," he assured me. "I said we weren't ready, and after what happened, they should understand why." "What did she say?" He sighed. "She said Dad feels terrible about the misunderstanding and wants to make amends." "Misunderstanding?" I echoed incredulously. "He accused me of cheating and said our baby wasn't yours." "That's not a misunderstanding." I know. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when stressed. "I told her that too. But she kept making excuses for him, saying he was just being protective and jumped to conclusions." "And did he even apologize? A real apology? Not that half-assed mumble at the hospital?" "According to Mom, he feels too embarrassed to call directly." My husband looked as frustrated as I felt. "She said he'd like to apologize in person." I switched the baby to my other breast, taking a moment to collect my thoughts. "I'm not ready to see him," I finally said. "Maybe in a few months, but not now. And definitely not with the baby." My husband nodded. "I'll let her know." But the calls and texts from my mother-in-law continued over the next few weeks, growing increasingly insistent. According to her, my father-in-law was suffering from being cut off from his only grandchild. He'd apparently told other family members about the situation, though his version painted him as the concerned grandfather who had been cruelly shut out for asking reasonable questions. When my son was about 2 months old, things came to a head. My husband's phone rang during dinner, and I could tell from his expression it was his mother again. He stepped into the other room to take the call, but I could hear his voice rising in anger. "That's not what happened. And you know it," he was saying when he came back into the kitchen. "No, Mom. No. He doesn't get to rewrite history just because the truth makes him look bad." He hung up and slumped into his chair, looking drained. "What now?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Dad's been telling everyone that we overreacted to his concerns and that we're using his grandson to punish him." He stabbed at his pasta with his fork. "Mom says the family is starting to take sides, and it's causing a rift. She wants us to be the bigger people and let him see the baby." I felt my blood pressure rising. "So, what? We're supposed to just pretend nothing happened? Let him near our child with no consequences for how he treated us? No real apology?" "Of course not," my husband said firmly. "I told her we're not budging unless Dad takes full responsibility and makes a genuine apology. I also said if he's spreading lies about us, that only proves he's not sorry at all." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for standing up for us." Later that night, after the baby was asleep, we talked more about the situation. As upset as I was, I knew this tension couldn't go on forever. My husband was caught in the middle, and it was clearly taking a toll on him. "What if we invited them to meet us at a restaurant?" I suggested. "Neutral territory. We could leave the baby with my mom. That way, we can talk to them face to face without worrying about the baby." My husband looked relieved. "Are you sure? You don't have to do this if you're not ready." "I'm not doing it for him," I said. "I'm doing it for us. We need to address this head on if we ever want to move forward." We set up the meeting for the following Saturday. My mother happily agreed to babysit, and we chose a quiet restaurant where we could talk without being overheard. I was nervous all morning, but also determined. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about setting the record straight and establishing boundaries. When we arrived at the restaurant, my in-laws were already there. My mother-in-law jumped up to greet us with hugs that I stiffly accepted. My father-in-law stood more slowly, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for meeting with us," he said as we sat down. He looked older somehow, the lines around his mouth deeper than I remembered. "We thought it was time to clear the air," my husband replied, his tone neutral. After we ordered drinks, an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Finally, my father-in-law cleared his throat. "I want to apologize for what happened at the hospital," he began. I was out of line. I waited for more, but he seemed to think that was sufficient. When neither my husband nor I responded, he added, "I was just concerned for my son." Concerned? I couldn't hold back anymore. "You accused me of cheating on your son and said our baby wasn't his. You ruined what should have been one of the happiest days of our lives. And now we hear you've been telling family members that we're overreacting?" "I never said," he started to protest, but my husband cut him off. "Dad, stop. We know exactly what you've been saying. The point is, you haven't taken any real responsibility for your actions. A real apology includes acknowledging what you did wrong and making amends." My father-in-law's face hardened. "What do you want from me? Blood?" I said I was sorry. "No," I said, leaning forward. "You said you were out of line and that you were concerned. That's not an apology, and it certainly doesn't address the damage you've done." "Damage?" He scoffed. "What damage? Everything turned out fine. The test proved the baby is my grandson." "The test proved what we already knew," my husband said, his voice tight with anger. "But you took something precious from us. The peace and joy of our son's birth. You caused my wife incredible stress right after she'd gone through labor. You've spread lies about us to our family, and you still don't seem to understand how wrong you were." My mother-in-law, who had been silent until now, placed her hand on her husband's arm. "Dear, please, they're right. What you did was terrible, and saying sorry isn't enough." He looked at her in surprise, clearly not expecting her to side against him. She turned to us, her eyes sad. "He does feel terrible, even if he's too proud to show it properly. We both miss you and the baby so much." I felt a twinge of sympathy for her, but stood my ground. "We need more than words. We need to know this will never happen again." My father-in-law stared down at his drink. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, to my astonishment, he said quietly, "What can I do to make this right?" The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I glanced at my husband, who looked equally surprised. "First," my husband said carefully, "we need a real apology, one that acknowledges exactly what you did wrong and why it was harmful. And second," I added, "you need to correct the story you've been telling family members. Let them know the truth." My father-in-law nodded slowly. "I can do that." I took a deep breath, gathering my courage for what I was about to say next. There was something that had been bothering me since our son was born, a memory that kept playing in my mind during those sleepless nights. "There's one more thing," I said. "During my pregnancy, at Easter dinner, you made a comment in front of the whole family. You said if the baby turned out to be your grandson after all, you'd set up a college fund for him and publicly acknowledge how wrong you were at the next big family gathering." His eyes widened. I don't recall saying that exactly." "You did," my mother-in-law confirmed. "Your brother was there too, and cousin and his wife." My husband nodded. "I remember it clearly. You stood up, glass in hand, and made that toast." My father-in-law shifted uncomfortably. "That was just talk." I was upset. "So your word means nothing?" my husband asked pointedly. The challenge hung in the air between them. My father-in-law's face flushed red, then seemed to deflate as the fight went out of him. "No, you're right. I did say that." He took a deep breath. "And I'll honor it. I'll set up the college fund, and at the family reunion next month, I'll make things right." I felt a wave of satisfaction. This was exactly what I had hoped for. Not just an apology, but a meaningful consequence that would benefit our son and publicly restore our reputation. "If you do those things," I said, "then we can start to move forward. But understand this. We will never allow you to disrespect either of us like that again. And any relationship you have with our son will depend on how you treat his parents." "I understand," he said. And for once, I believed him. As we left the restaurant, I felt lighter than I had in months. We hadn't fully resolved everything, and trust would take time to rebuild, but we had a path forward. And more importantly, we had stood up for ourselves and our family. On the drive home, my husband reached over and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. That was impressive. I was terrified, I admitted. I kept thinking he'd just storm out or call me a liar. "I think you caught him off guard. I've never seen my dad back down like that." He squeezed my hand. "Do you think he'll follow through?" "I honestly don't know," I replied. "But if he doesn't, at least we tried. And we've shown him we won't be pushed around anymore." When we got home, my mother reported that the baby had been an angel. As I nursed him before bed, I wondered what the coming weeks would bring. Had we actually gotten through to my father-in-law? Or was this just another manipulation? A week later, my husband received an email from a financial institution. His father had indeed set up a college fund for our son, with an initial deposit of $10,000. It was a start, a tangible sign that maybe, just maybe, he was serious about making amends. But the real test would come at the family reunion the following month. Would he publicly acknowledge what he'd done? Or would he find some way to wriggle out of it? As the reunion approached, my anxiety grew. What if he minimized what had happened? What if he turned it into a joke? What if he made it seem like we had demanded money from him? I had nightmares about showing up and having the entire family glare at us as the ungrateful, demanding couple who had forced poor grandpa to jump through hoops. The day before the reunion, I almost told my husband I wasn't going, but I knew that would only make things worse. We had to see this through. The annual family reunion was held at a large park, with about 60 family members in attendance. We arrived with our 3-month-old son, who was alert and cheerful in his little sun hat. It was his first time meeting many of his extended family members, and he was passed around from cousin to aunt to uncle, charming everyone with his toothless smile. There was definitely some awkwardness. A few relatives seemed to be keeping their distance, while others went out of their way to be extra friendly. I overheard snippets of conversations that stopped abruptly when people noticed me nearby. My husband's cousin's wife actually asked me, "So, is everything okay now with your father-in-law?" Before I could respond, her husband pulled her away, whispering something that made her face turn red. My father-in-law kept his distance at first, observing from afar. But when it was time for the traditional family lunch, he asked for everyone's attention by tapping his glass with a spoon. My stomach knotted. This was it. I reached for my husband's hand and squeezed it tightly. "I'd like to say a few words," my father-in-law announced, his voice carrying across the picnic area. "As most of you know, I recently became a grandfather." People smiled and nodded, a few glancing our way. "What some of you may have heard," he continued, "is that there was a disagreement between me and my son and daughter-in-law around the time of the birth." The crowd grew quieter, sensing this wasn't going to be the typical light-hearted speech. "The truth is," my father-in-law said, his voice growing more serious, "I behaved terribly. I made accusations that were completely unfounded. I questioned the paternity of my own grandson, causing immense pain to my son and his wife during what should have been the happiest time of their lives." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked shocked, others uncomfortable. "I was proven wrong, of course," he went on. "But the damage was done. And in my pride, I continued to minimize my actions instead of taking responsibility for them." He looked directly at us now. "I want to publicly apologize to my son and daughter-in-law. What I did was inexcusable, and I am deeply, truly sorry." I felt tears welling in my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. This was more than I had dared to hope for, a complete, unambiguous admission of guilt and a sincere apology. "To demonstrate my commitment to making amends," he continued, "I've established a college fund for my grandson, which I will contribute to annually. And more importantly, I pledge to be a better father and grandfather, one who shows respect, kindness, and support to his family." When he finished speaking, there was a moment of stunned silence before people began to applaud tentatively. My husband squeezed my hand, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Later, my father-in-law approached us with an envelope. "This contains the details of the college fund," he said, handing it to my husband. "I've made an initial deposit of $10,000, and I'll add to it every birthday and Christmas." "Thank you," my husband said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." "There's something else," my father-in-law said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. "This is for the baby. It's a family heirloom, my father's gold pocket watch. I'd like him to have it someday." I was speechless. The watch was a treasured family possession, something I knew my father-in-law valued greatly. "Are you sure?" my husband asked, clearly as surprised as I was. "Yes," my father-in-law said firmly. "He's my grandson, my blood. It should go to him." As he held out his arms questioningly, I nodded and handed him the baby. It was the first time he'd held his grandson, and the look of wonder on his face as he gazed down at the tiny human in his arms was genuine and moving. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Your grandpa was a fool, but he's going to make it up to you." Over the next few months, my father-in-law proved that his change of heart was genuine. He was respectful of our boundaries, never showing up unannounced or questioning our parenting decisions. He sent thoughtful gifts and called regularly to check in, but never pressed for more time or access than we were comfortable with. Slowly, we began to rebuild trust. We started with short visits at our house, then eventually progressed to leaving the baby with my in-laws for an hour or two so we could have a date night. My father-in-law was a different person with our son, gentle, patient, and completely smitten. About 6 months after the family reunion, my husband commented on the change in his father. "I've never seen him like this," he said as we drove home from dropping the baby off for an afternoon visit. "He was always so rigid when I was growing up. Everything had to be his way." "People can change, I guess," I replied, though I was still cautious, especially when they're forced to face the consequences of their actions. "You know," my husband said thoughtfully, "I think in some weird way, this whole mess was the best thing that could have happened. Not the accusations themselves, that was awful, but the way we stood up to him. It's like he finally respects us as adults." I had to admit there was some truth to that. The old dynamics had been broken, and something healthier was taking its place. My father-in-law no longer treated my husband like a subordinate, and he'd stopped making passive-aggressive comments about my career or parenting choices. The most surprising change was in his relationship with my mother-in-law. I noticed it first at a Sunday dinner at their house when our son was about 8 months old. My father-in-law asked her opinion about something, then actually listened to her answer. He didn't interrupt or dismiss her thoughts as he might have done before. Later, I saw him touch her hand affectionately, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "Your parents seem different with each other," I mentioned to my husband on the drive home. "I know," he said, sounding amazed. "Mom told me Dad's been going to therapy. She said after the family reunion, he had some kind of breakthrough. He realized he almost lost his relationship with his only son and grandchild because of his controlling behavior." Therapy? I couldn't hide my shock. This was a man who had always dismissed mental health concerns as touchy-feely nonsense. "I can hardly believe it either," my husband admitted, "but apparently he's been going regularly for months. Mom says he's working through some stuff from his own childhood." I digested this information silently. I had never considered that my father-in-law's behavior might stem from his own past wounds. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me understand it better. A year after the hospital incident, we celebrated our son's first birthday with a small party at our home. My father-in-law arrived with an additional contribution to the college fund and a handmade wooden rocking horse he'd spent months crafting in his workshop. "I hope he likes it," he said anxiously as he helped my husband bring it inside. "I've never made anything like this before." The rocking horse was beautiful, with smooth, rounded edges and a mane made of real horsehair. My son's eyes widened when he saw it, and he immediately reached for it, squealing with delight. "I think that's a yes," I laughed, watching my father-in-law's face light up with pride. Later, as my father-in-law helped my son rock back and forth on his new toy, I found myself standing next to my mother-in-law in the kitchen. "He's been working on that rocking horse for months," she told me quietly, "getting up early every morning before work to sand it or varnish it. I've never seen him put so much care into anything." I nodded, watching the two of them through the doorway. My son was giggling, and my father-in-law was laughing with him, their heads close together in a moment of pure joy. "He's changed," I acknowledged. "Because of you," she said, surprising me. "Both of you. Standing up to him like that, it made him take a hard look at himself. And I want to thank you for that. It's not just his relationship with you and the baby that's improved." I glanced at her, noting the subtle but significant changes in her appearance. She stood straighter, seemed more confident, expressed her own opinions more freely. She wasn't just my father-in-law's shadow anymore. The party was a success, with our son smashing his cake and opening presents with more interest in the wrapping paper than the gifts themselves. As everyone prepared to leave, my father-in-law pulled me aside. I wanted to say something, he began awkwardly. It's been a year since, well, since I made the biggest mistake of my life. I tensed slightly, not wanting to revisit those painful memories on my son's special day. I know today isn't about that, he continued, sensing my discomfort. But I just wanted to say again how sorry I am, and how grateful I am that you and my son found it in your hearts to give me a second chance. His sincerity was unmistakable. This wasn't the grudging semi-apology from the hospital or the defensive posturing from the restaurant. This was genuine remorse and gratitude. It wasn't easy, I admitted, but I'm glad we found a way forward. For his sake, I nodded toward my son, who was being entertained by my husband. Not just for his sake, I hope, my father-in-law said softly. I'd like to think we could have been a real family even without him. But he certainly makes it easier to remember what's important. I smiled, realizing he was right. Our son had been the catalyst, but the healing that had occurred was valuable for all of us. As the next few years passed, our relationship with my in-laws continued to strengthen. My father-in-law remained committed to therapy, working through the controlling tendencies that had damaged so many of his relationships. He became a devoted grandfather, always eager to babysit, build blanket forts, or read endless storybooks. When I became pregnant with our second child, a daughter, his excitement was genuine and untainted by suspicion. He was one of the first people we called with the news, and his tearful congratulations left no doubt about his joy. The day our daughter was born, he brought flowers to the hospital and waited patiently in the waiting room until we were ready for visitors. When I saw him holding his granddaughter for the first time, looking at her with the same wonder and love he now showed our son, I felt the last of my old resentment melt away. She's perfect, he whispered, gently touching her tiny fingers. Just like her mother. My eyes met his, and in that moment, I knew that the path we'd chosen, holding him accountable while allowing space for genuine change, had been the right one. As I watched my family together, my husband beaming with pride, our son peering curiously at his new sister, my mother-in-law taking photos, and my father-in-law cradling our daughter with tears in his eyes, I reflected on how far we'd come from that terrible day in the hospital. What had started as one of the worst experiences of my life had ultimately led to healing and growth none of us could have imagined. My father-in-law had faced the consequences of his actions, made genuine amends, and emerged as a better person, a better father, husband, and grandfather. And I had discovered my own strength, the power to stand up for myself and my family, to demand respect, and to forgive when that respect was finally earned. Our children would grow up in a family where boundaries were respected, apologies were genuine, and love was expressed openly. The cycle of control and resentment that had marked my husband's childhood had been broken. In the end, I did get my revenge, but it wasn't through punishment or humiliation. The sweetest revenge was seeing my father-in-law transform from an arrogant, controlling man into a humble, loving grandfather who acknowledged his mistakes and worked hard to make amends. And yes, I definitely came out on top. Not just because I was proven right, but because my family emerged stronger, my marriage deeper, and my children surrounded by people who had learned the hard way how precious family bonds truly are. Sometimes, the most satisfying endings aren't about defeating your enemies, but about watching them become better people, especially when it benefits the people you love most in the world. Update. It's been 5 years since the incident at the hospital, and I wanted to share how things have evolved. Our son is now an energetic kindergartner who adores his grandpa. Yes, the same man who once questioned his paternity is now his favorite playmate. My father-in-law has become an incredible grandfather, patient, engaged, and always ready for adventures. The college fund has grown significantly. My father-in-law not only contributes regularly, but has encouraged other family members to add to it on birthdays and holidays, instead of buying too many toys. The most surprising development has been my relationship with my father-in-law. We've developed a genuine respect for each other. He often tells people that confronting him was the best thing that could have happened, as it forced him to examine his controlling behavior. He's even apologized to my mother-in-law for years of dismissing her opinions, and their relationship has improved tremendously. During a recent family gathering, my son fell and scraped his knee. Before I could even react, my father-in-law was there, scooping him up and comforting him. As I watched them together, my husband squeezed my hand and whispered, "Who would have thought we'd end up here?" Indeed, sometimes the hardest confrontations lead to the most unexpected healing. Anyway, thank you for watching.